on to our final speaker, who I'm actually really excited to welcome today, Dr. Johannes Doemer. So before I read his bio, I'd also like to say that he was on the Safety Services New Brunswick podcast, and I really enjoyed it. There's going to be some overlap between what was said on the podcast, I think, and what we see today. But if you are interested in listening to it, you can look up the Safety Services New Brunswick podcast on your podcast app or on YouTube. And the episode I really enjoyed that he was on was called Silica, the New Asbestos of This Decade. So I will put that link in the chat in a moment. So Johannes Doemer, I'll just introduce him right now, has been an occupational hygienist with WorkSafe New Brunswick since 2019, assisting workplaces in the anticipation and reduction of health hazards to prevent occupational diseases. He previously worked as an occupational hygienist and senior consultant with Resource Environmental Associates Limited in Toronto. He has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Münster, Germany, and has an extensive background in scientific research and health and safety. So we're so thankful that Johannes has made time to be here for today, talking about Silica, the Silica control tool, and the experiences in New Brunswick. So thank you and welcome to Johannes.
Thank you very much, Krista, for the nice introduction and for the opportunity to speak here as well. And yes, I will share, I will try to share my screen. Just give me a second here. Okay, did that work? Can everybody see? Okay, yes. Perfect. Silica control tool, yeah, a New Brunswick perspective. As you heard, I'm occupational hygienist with WorkSafe New Brunswick, so I am part of the regulator. And from the previous comments, I try to not look at myself as one of the bad guys who give punitive sentences all the time, but we do have a slightly different perspective, of course, but I'll try to share this. I'll try to illustrate how we anticipate really incorporating the Silica control tool into our work, into New Brunswick, and really into kind of our mission to enhance the health and safety and particularly the health of New Brunswick's workers. I do have a slide deck. However, we heard a bit of the information that's on the slides already. So part of this will be fairly quick. And as I said, I'll try to highlight our perspective on this and share this. I typically start by explaining, well, this terminology, respirable silica. What does that really mean? And respirable is referring to the size of the dust that we are inhaling, and respirable fraction is really that tiny little fraction that we can't otherwise actually notice in our respiratory system, other than it eventually will deposit in our lungs and will really create the very significant diseases and health effects. In that sense, there's already the first parallel to asbestos, and as you mentioned, there is an association between kind of the asbestos exposure and silica exposure, and the mode of action, how these substances interact really with our lungs is fairly similar. Asbestosis and silicosis, there are some parallels. Both are related to lung cancer, of course, and both are really what I would call a silent killer. The part that bothers us and that kind of makes us cough is really not the part of the dust that we should be worried about. We should be worried about what we can see and what can travel deep into our lungs. As we heard before, silica is pretty much all around us, and that's just the point of this slide, is really showing you. You're doing work activity on a construction site, for instance, chances are you're going to run into silica. And then it becomes the question, are we making it airborne? As soon as we have any kind of process that creates really dust, that creates concrete dust or silica dust, we are at risk of exposing ourselves to respirable silica. So really these processes that make silica airborne are naturally happening at construction sites, which can explain why construction safety associations and construction sites are particularly interested in the hazard of respirable silica and preventing it, of course. But we also have, other industries that are at risk. And we also heard about the health effects of silica exposure. So besides lung cancer, yes, we have silicosis, which is effectively scarring of the lung tissue. It is a fatal disease depending on the severity, and typically in most scenarios it is fairly slow onset disease as well, similar to asbestosis. We're looking typically at numerous years of exposure and a significant latency period. However, and that's part of what really brought respirable silica on the agenda of also us as regulators, is we do see in other parts of the world, in other jurisdictions, cases now of acute silicosis, which cases which show that even very short amount of time, months to a year of exposure to respirable silica can lead to significant health effects, can lead to silicosis. So with the rise of engineered stone, that is one concern. So it is important, and what we really try to avoid here is a situation that, so to say, the next asbestos, right? And the silica control tool will hopefully work in this capacity as well to help us. Now we have various different tasks, positions, jobs at risk. Of course, a lot of this happens on construction sites, but not all of it. We have agriculture, mining, manufacturing sectors, which are also heavily affected by the risk of silica dust. And I'm mentioning this because, of course, the BCCSA is a construction safety association. We are partnering with NBCSA, our construction safety association, but the use of this tool, at least in New Brunswick, is not limited to the construction industry. It will start there, but we certainly want to see other industries involved in this as well. So now, from our New Brunswick perspective, we do have an occupational exposure limit for crystalline silica, the respirable fraction, which stands at 0.025 milligrams per cubic meter. But really, what does that mean? What does it mean? Can somebody go out and look at a silica process and, okay, this is more or less than 0.025 milligrams per cubic meter? No, of course not. I mean, for silica, it's fairly evident. If there's a dust cloud, you have a problem. But other than that, it doesn't tell you much. So the question really becomes, how do we control effectively then for crystalline silica? And in our regulation, we are fortunate enough to have a section that speaks directly to this scenario, and I printed it here also because it is a bit different than what Ontario would have in legislation. But we have a section that requires an employer to monitor the air, so to test the air, if there's a situation where the level of concentration of an air contaminant may be approaching 50% of the occupational exposure limit. So as I said, for silica, pretty much as soon as you have a dust generating process, as soon as you see a dust cloud, you're pretty much there. There are other scenarios where you don't even have a visible dust and still might be approaching 50%. But certainly if there's something visible in the air, this clause would get triggered. So employers then are required to test the air to determine the concentration of the air contaminant and to implement necessary controls. So traditionally, what would that mean? Traditionally, that would mean we would have to put a sampling device on an operator. We would have to run the sample. We have to, well, kind of send the sample to the lab, kind of wait around until we get the results. And then eventually we have the results and we can go back to the worker and say, well, listen, remember that concrete cutting that you did 3 weeks ago? Your respiratory protection was actually appropriate or not. So of course I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I guess the point that I'm getting at the classical approach of air monitoring and then looking at the results is just not as protective of the individual, especially if you think of work environments which are very very dynamic, such as a construction site. So this is really where the Silica control tool comes in for us. The Silica control tool provides an option to get an exposure estimate much quicker, much more reliable, actually, in a sense, and at a much lower cost for the employer. And all of those factors combined lead to a much better protection of the worker going forward. Also, I also mentioned that we think it's more reliable, and this is just from an occupational hygienist perspective. If we follow that classical approach and have like one or two samples that are taken doing a given task, the predictability of this to be used for future determination of the level of controls that we need is, of course, much less than if we can dive into a database of 5,000 plus data points. And both Melanie and Victoria talked to this. So also from that perspective, for me as an occupational hygienist, I'm quite excited about the tool and bringing it to New Brunswick, because it does allow us to increase much better predictability in terms of what exposure our workers are really facing. So as I said, this is really where the Silica control tool comes in, and we heard about this. This is online risk assessment tool based on numerous samples, and we are now the kind of third jurisdiction that adopts this tool. The way that it worked for us is that we collaborated with NBCSA, so our Construction Safety Association, and WorkSafe essentially collaborated with NBCSA, provided funding or part of the funding, and the tool itself is hosted by NBCSA. Another, so to say, storyline that I like on this is that in the lead up to bringing the Silica control tool to New Brunswick, we used something that we call alternative sentencing for court cases. So New Brunswick is going the more and more the approach of using the court fees or the fees from prosecution cases for alternative sentencing. So the judges do have the option to allocate those fines to projects that are believed to increase and benefit workers' health and safety in New Brunswick. And part of the funding for the Silica control tool in New Brunswick stems from one of those alternative sentencing cases. We had a case of prosecution where one of our larger health networks was prosecuted for asbestos exposure scenarios. So we had quite a number of people exposed over the years. We have had a lack of control, a fairly convincing case. And in the sentencing, we recommended that the alternative sentencing should go towards prevention of, and there's that parallel to asbestos again, to another lung disease. So silicosis prevention, the Silica control tool was then funded through this alternative sentencing. And I really like the story because, as I mentioned, we do have parallels between asbestosis and silicosis. Yes, so we do have parallels in terms of the hazard itself. But if you look at almost historically where we are in the prevention of asbestosis versus silicosis, most of the jurisdictions in Canada are fairly far ahead on dealing with the asbestos hazard nowadays. We have fairly enhanced regulations. In New Brunswick, we call it our code of practice. It's a very detailed, very enhanced piece of the regulation, and we have a good handle from a regulatory perspective on asbestos itself. We are just in the process of as a country, trying to get it completely out of our facilities and out of our workplaces. But in that sense, we don't have to do any fundamental research or protective work on asbestos anymore. It's more a matter of implementing correctly what we have and then enforcing it correctly. Whereas in silica, we are not there yet. And the silica control tool is, I think, one of the very important steps that we can implement, that we can really use to significantly impact the health of New Brunswickers, of workers in Canada in general, if we implement this correctly. And that's one of the reasons why I like this parallel, and why I like this the use of the silica control tool itself as well. As I mentioned, we do have collaboration with NBCSA, and the way that we integrate. Just going back a couple of slides here, I shared our clause that requires the air to be tested by employers under circumstances where we reach 50% of the occupational exposure limit. So we, as the regulator, have taken the stand that we do accept silica control tool exposure estimates as a way to prove to us that the air is tested, so that this specific section can be fulfilled by using the silica control tool, as opposed to going out and paying for testing and going the classical approach. So this is how we can tie it into our regulation, and how we can, so to say, I wouldn't say the word enforce, but how we can push the use of the silica control tool really in New Brunswick. I'm going to skip over a few of these slides because we are fairly familiar with this. As you would know, in the silica control tool, it's just a screenshot. You do select your task, the material, select the tool, work area, you get your exposure assessment, exposure analysis. Then you select your controls. And I just want to spend just a few seconds on this. The silica control tool, if you are not as familiar with it, is actually a great educational tool as well. It incorporates controls. It incorporates the hierarchy of controls, and will actually walk the user through the best control options that can be used for the given scenario. Which is very helpful for the user, and again can be used greatly for the education of users as well as of the workforce. As engineering controls are selected, and Melanie talked to this, that might change the exposure analysis. So the exposure analysis with controls is then what in the end will be used to estimate the required respiratory protection that is needed. And in our version of the silica control tool, we aligned this with the CSA standard that we cite in regulation for selection, use, and care of respirators. So this slide just illustrates how those are aligned. The exposure control plan itself, and again, I'll skip over most of this, but what I want to highlight is that there's a summary. There's a summary page in this exposure control plan which summarizes the exposure, but which will also, again, what kind of process was selected and what kind of engineering controls were selected. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because from our enforcement strategy, from so to say a compliance strategy, that enables us as a regulator to do a very simple and easy check if we see a silica process on site. And it's essentially these 5 points. So is a silica process used on site? If so, we would require that we see an exposure control plan, or that the silica control tool is being used. the employer would have the option to indicate, no, I don't want to use the silica control tool. But in that case, we would want to see really exposure data. So then we would require the employer to actually do the testing and do the monitoring themselves. So we expect that most employers will, of course, use the silica control tool. So once that is in place, we would want to see the exposure control plan and then take a look, does the process that is being described in the exposure control plan match what's being observed on site? Do the engineering controls match what's being observed on site? And finally, does a respiratory protection that is mentioned in the exposure control plan match what's being on site, or does the respiratory protection that is used on site exceed what is required by the exposure control plan? So from our perspective, and again, we are a small province, especially when it comes to occupational hygienist. We have 2 FTEs at the moment who are serving the entire province from an occupational hygiene perspective. What's nice from my perspective on the silica control tool is that these easy 5 checks actually enable people with very limited or almost no occupational hygiene background to actually do compliance checks and to also promote the exposure control tool and to really ensure that the silica control tool is appropriately used on site. So also from as a regulator, this is a great tool, makes our life much easier, and so to say extends greatly the potential eyes and ears that we have out in the field. So also we expect from that perspective a nice impact. I just want to close it by showing you essentially where we are in terms of launching the silica control tool and in terms of the resources we have published so far. So we, I guess, formally launched the silica control tool about a month ago. It is free to all New Brunswick employers. As discussed with Melanie, essentially what an employer needs to show is that they are registered with us, that they have a WorkSafe New Brunswick number, and that verification happens on the BCCSA side. And once that is done, the employer or the representative of the employer can create an account and can use the silica control tool for free, which is nice. So we created a safety topic on our web site, Scribe Silica. You can see a screenshot here that supports this. Is links to the tool. We have a webinar or video on how to use the tool. So stepwise, really describing how it is being used. We have now started with handouts, some printed material that will be heading out on construction sites, and next year we'll do a roadshow with the NBCSA, with our partner, to promote the tool further. And one thing that I should mention, New Brunswick is a bilingual province, so there will be a French version of the tool available. However, that is in process at the moment, but the significant part of the translation of the tool has already happened. So we expect that in the not too far distant future as well. And also there, quite excited about this. Okay. And with that, thank you very much for having me. And are there any questions, any feedback?
Okay, I see Kimberly O'Connell has raised her hand.
Sorry, my computer is a little slow. I apologize. Johannes, I'm so sorry. I owe you 2 things. Apologies. My comments were not absolutely. We wish in Ontario that we could use this for, well, a couple things. We wish we had the lower OEL, which was the intent of the tool. That's why it's best practice right now, because our OEL is higher than yours and BC's. We're working on that. We hope. We wish it could be used as enforcement. My comments on the arm's length was that the use of the enforcement is that the worker, the workplace, the employer are using the tool and showing the enforcement agency, here's what we did with the tool to show and a risk assessment. So that's all I meant. It's not in the tool to go right to the enforcement agency, the data, to say, oh, you know what, you put data in. If they're not share, you know, your data that you put in, we're going to come after you. I guess that was my comment with the arm's length, you know, to go with Melanie's talk, not to introduce yours. So we want, the second comment I want to make is that we're very grateful we've been partnering with New Brunswick with some discussions and this growth of the tool across the country. And they are gifting us the French version of the tool. So that is a really exciting announcement for folks. So thank you again. I hope that clarifies my comment on enforcement. Johannes, we wish
no worries. I was just teasing.
Okay, there was a question and already answered by Dr. Gormaning in the chat, but I'm just going to read it out for those who may not have had it open, and you probably wouldn't be able to see it, Johannes. Kevin was thankful for the presentations today. His question was around the occupational exposure limit of 0.025 milligrams per cubic meter. He was asking, are we able to meet a limit of quantification at 1/10 of the OEL, and if so, what method do you use? So Melanie says, it's not usually possible for task-based sampling, but for an 8-hour sample with the 8 liters per minute PPI sampler, that's parallel particle impactor sampler, it's a type of method. It is possible. There are some new initiatives to develop lower limit of detection respirable crystalline silica analytical methods. So she and I am too looking forward to these developments in the area. The low OEL does reflect its toxicity and highlights the importance of controlling exposure, is what she says there. It is definitely a health-based limit. That is the limit in both New Brunswick and as well in British Columbia. And I also put the link to the WorkSafe New Brunswick safety topic on silica in the link for those who are in the chat. I just found it by Googling WorkSafe New Brunswick safety topic silica, and it popped right up. So you can find it that way too. Any other questions for Johannes? You put your hand up, you can unmute, you can put it in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Krista. And just a quick comment on the occupation exposure limit. So also for us, it's timely because we just, and I say this from a timeline of a regulator, so 2-3 years ago now, but we just lowered our exposure limit for respirable silica to 0.025 as well. So it is timely.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to conclude our session with a few closing remarks. So first, thank you to Drs. Arundel, Gormaning, and Dr. Doemer as well for being here today and giving up your time. We really appreciate that you all have made yourselves available. This was our second session of October and beyond as we focus on occupational health and disease prevention. So I just want to note that Francis Bacon said knowledge is power, and Kofi Annan expanded on this saying information is liberating. And I think these tools that have been developed and that are under development can really help workers, employers, just everyone to understand more about their workplace potential for exposures, but the control measures. More than one speaker today acknowledged those control measures really help. The tool guides you through selecting those control measures and shows you what potentially that could reduce exposure by. So the link has been put in the chat. That is to a brief survey for you to offer feedback, and as well the same link is where you can request a certificate of attendance for attending today. We do not correlate the remarks you give us to the name. We will email all certificates of attendance in early December, so stay tuned for that. Before we close out, I'd like to tell you what's happening next week and for the rest of our sessions. So next week is, can you assess exposures you can't measure? So Alex Mercer, who is president of the CRBOH, she's an in-demand speaker at Occupational and Exposure Control Banding. She'll be joining us to talk about how exposure control banding can work. So occupational hygienists are experts in measuring and assessing hazards and interpreting risk based on exposure limits. But what happens when we don't have exposure measurements, and it's not silica because that's the only one with this tool, or when we don't have an exposure limit? How do we know what's hazardous? So Alex is going to be here to talk more about how exposure and control banding can apply. We will also be doing a memorial to Dr. Thomas Tenkate, who is was phenomenal in developing exposure control banding through his CHAP tool. So we will be talking about that as well. On November 21st, Dr. Kevin Hedges will be presenting along with respirator expert Dr. Simon Smith on how to apply risk assessments to respirator selection and going through aspects of the CSA respirator risk selection algorithms there. And we'll close our October and beyond on November 28th, featuring speakers from Ontario Health and Safety System Partners. We'll have Steve Gore from Workplace Safety North, Jasmine Kelsey from Infrastructure Health and Safety Association, and Kelly Fernandez from Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, all sharing their latest efforts on occupational disease prevention in Ontario. So thank you again for attending today. Please take a moment to honor Ontario Treaties Week and pause to reflect on Remembrance Day if those are things that are meaningful for you, and have a good rest of your day.